Hi guys, welcome to the Chatbot conference. This is our on-demand section, and today I'm interviewing Vittorio from Botsociety. Vittorio is an expert when it comes to all things design. His background's in design. Vittorio, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and Botsociety?
Sure. I'm Vittorio. I'm the founder of Botsociety. Botsociety is a way to design chatbots and voice in assistants. So we're kind of like the Photoshop for conversational interfaces. We then integrate with, popular technologies to actually build the bots after you design them on Botsociety.
Got it. Yeah, I also think of like Sketch for bots.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we want to be, at least. Yeah.
So Vittorio, how did you get involved in bots? What interested you in it? Tell us your story.
Yeah, so I think the first time that I started thinking about bots, I was a kid.
Okay.
And I was on IRC chat. I don't know if you've ever been there. I feel very old when I'm telling this story now, but I was very young. I was like 11. And IRC was like an entirely separate protocol. So like you would go on the web on the HTTP, and then you would go on the chat on IRC. And you could build bots there. You had chats and stuff, a lot of people. That was very fun. And then fast forward 2017, me and my now co-founder, we started an agency to make bots for big companies in Italy. And it grew very fast. We had to hire 2 people in 2 weeks. We had 2 big contracts in the first month. It was crazy. And we're expecting someone in Silicon Valley to come up with a design tool for bots and voice. So I remember Googling and looking on Product Hunt and asking in groups, and nobody was doing that. So we built one internally for us to use. And then Dennis Young, for that at the time was a Dashbot, put it on Product Hunt, and it got a lot of traction. So we decided to sell the agency and move to California to try to do that full time, and things ballooned from there.
Yeah, I remember that's how we met. Was that your first day, week?
Yeah, it was I think it was day number 9 in San Francisco or something like that.
So that's what I love about the city. It's so exciting in that way. You get to like run into people that are working on cool things. When you first started doing Botsociety and creating the tool, why weren't the current tools at the time good enough, like ChatFuel or ManyChat? Because a lot of people use those for design instead, and kind of would make a really nice demo.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of ManyChat and ChatFuel, full disclosure. Yeah. I think they're great tools. At the same time, that they're not built to design stuff. They're built to be your one-stop shop to get one things done and then release it. Right. So you have limitations there. You can only design for certain platforms. You cannot design anything that you want. You need to, stay inside the rails that are there. And the upside of that is then you can just release it. But what we feel like is like, okay, there's a certain type of bots which are like that, but there's another type of bots that need to be very custom, where the design phase has to be free. You need to be able to drag and drop your messages around. You need to be able to come up with anything. The same way that you can build a website with Squarespace, and then you need to follow the Squarespace stuff, and then you just release it. Yeah. Or if your website is complex enough, you will want to actually write the code afterwards, and so design it on Sketch or Figma, and then write the code. So I think for bots it's going to be the same, and Squarespace is very big, and Figma is very big, and so there's there's use cases and the tools for each use case.
Right. And I remember when these design tools first came up, it was beautiful to see them come up. In your experience, how have bots evolved since 2017 when you first got in? I remember when I first got in 2016, we thought that bots would become the new apps. We had a lot of hopes and dreams. And I can answer the question afterwards, but in your experience, like how has it evolved? from that time?
Yeah, so what we always felt like was
Mhm.
that the bots are an interface
Mhm.
that you can leverage. And so that is a very specific thing. So when we started it, there was a lot of interest and an active community, but I think part of the community, as you mentioned, was expecting to create um, new products, which were actually the same products as before, just with the new interface.
Right.
And that's not what an interface is. It doesn't allow you to just come up with a new product by itself. Um, and so I think that's normal. Like each time something new appears, there's a moment where like the hive mind tries everything. Um, and so it was very exciting. It was very funny. It is still today. I think right now it's way more mature, so it's way clearer for everybody what are the interesting use cases, what is the advantage of using this interface. Um, and I think there have been successful startups who challenge the incumbent with a mix of the new interface and a new service, the new interface and a new product. And that works. But you can't just slap a bot on it and think it changes, right? So that's very clear right now. And I think we're starting to see bots that actually are advanced and provide a lot of value compared to at first, of course, like the level of depth was not, that advanced, both on the design and technological side.
Right. I remember the feeling back then. Everyone just assumed they would become the new apps, and it was literally like a solution looking for a problem. Everyone was looking at, okay, this is the solution. Let's find the problem, you know. And it just good things are never built that way. It's always they're built because there's a demand for a solution. There's a big problem, and eventually someone's going to solve it. Um, and I think they've evolved in a really interesting way. Like, I think that the assumption back then was that there would be a lot more B2C, but right now they're actually more B2B. And the use cases, like you said, it's all about it being a communication channel, um, an interface where people can communicate and get things done in maybe a more efficient way. And use case wise, I remember first it was marketing that like did really well with bots, like the messenger bots, for Shopify, for example. And then the second wave was what is like trending more and more towards AI, customer service, as the AI piece gets together. And the thing that I'm seeing most recently is kind of like these really interesting knowledge bases, essentially. So one of them was a bot that was a psychiatrist, and you can talk to it, and it can help decrease your anxiety, for example, and so on and so on. And I think we're seeing that like with Giant and a few others in the medical space, where they're kind of becoming more like knowledge bases that can help you solve a problem as the user.
Yeah, exactly. Which does not mean that like it's a set of questions with a set of answers and that's it. It actually gets more complex than that. And I think to mature, like we had as an ecosystem to take our time to mature to that position where to solve a problem, maybe not just getting back with an answer like a FAQ list would do. It needs to be a little bit more advanced.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what does that look like the deeper we go? Because like initially it was very simple, like where are my shoes that I just ordered? Okay, what's your email address? Okay, they're arriving on Wednesday. But now it's getting a lot deeper with these knowledge bases. So what are some of the things that we can do now that we couldn't do before? And then like as you design, you can't design like a single conversation anymore, because you know it's more like there's many different possible different directions a conversation can go.
Yeah.
So how do you design for those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a convergence of users getting more advanced, expecting more and understanding more how to use this, and designers understanding more, but also iterating more on the designs and getting more data. And so, for example, one of the things that we see our Botsociety 2, which is our new product that we're launching, doing is create an holistic experience. So what that means is like, instead of starting with question answer, you start to ask yourself, okay, how do we solve this problem for the user? And then build flows from there. And again, that's a convergence of like users getting used to that. So like when we started, there were not a lot of people when you were talking around that said, yeah, I tried a bot. Now almost everybody's saying that. So that's a huge difference in user expectations. And at the same time, that this can be leveraged on the design side, so you can do stuff like dedicated fallback paths or other conversational patterns like that.
So talk a little bit more about the dedicated fallback path. What is that exactly? How does it work?
Yeah, so
what is the best way, like, for designers, whether they're new or just coming in and starting out, for them to think about bots or conversational design? Like, what's a good mental model for it?
So I think that's the $1,000 question. Well, okay, so I think the good mental model is you're designing an interface. It just doesn't have screens, but it has questions.
Right.
And it doesn't have a color, but it has a personality. So you cannot put a color there, but you need to craft the personality and give that feeling. And you don't have buttons, but you have flows. So that's the first switch, is like switching from a graphical way of thinking to a more conversational way of thinking. I think that's the first mental model. And I think the second one is starting to think about stories. So like, how would a conversation go, and then try to make another story of the same conversation going maybe sideways or asking different questions. And then you start to branch your conversation interface from there.
I think that idea of stories is really powerful, because it's like, we're hardwired to think in stories. We're hardwired to like remember things in a story format. So even like for recall, it would lift recall if it's a good story. One of the really interesting things that I find about like conversational design is that it replicates or it mimics what you and I are doing right now, like us having this conversation. And in the same way that we have to take all these cues into account, like, how the person's responding to you and so on. In the bot, it's harder to do that because, it's, first of all, it's just text. Or if it's a voice, it's just voice. So there isn't, you're missing that, 60, 70% of information that kind of paints a picture when you have someone in front of you, for example. And I think the other challenge is like, as a user, you don't necessarily have a guide in terms of which direction to go, the same way you would with the graphical user interface, right? With the graphical user interface, it's like a static piece of content that's not changing. It's not dynamic in any way. So, like this menu button is going to do a drop down, and you can go here and it'll go to so-and-so page. But with a bot, you don't have that foresight. And so is our stories the best way to solve for this? Or what are some of the best ways to
Yeah, I think that's crucial. This is the way that I'm looking at it. So even when you have real life conversations, these conversations do not happen in a vacuum.
Right.
There's a certain setup, there's certain context that sets the tone of the conversation, right? If instead of this being a Zoom call, we were in a university, it would already be a different conversation on some level. And if you were the professor, it would be a totally different context that I would be talking to, right? And so even the same words would have a different meaning. Like we would attribute to the conversation a slightly different dynamic. And so I think when you're creating an artificial conversation, it's on the designer to establish this context. In the same way that, you know, when they came up with the Macintosh, they had to establish the desktop, so they placed like a trash icon with a small trash there. It was not needed technically, but it helped set up the context for the user.
Right, exactly. And, you know, you have a real trash can in your real life, and so that helps tremendously. Yeah. What are some other like design conventions for bots that you would really like recommend designers consider and play around with and implement in their own designs?
Yeah, so one of them would be, I mean, those are in the end, like the conventions end up being simple things, apparently, that kind of like, again, the trash icon is, at the end, is a simple thing, right? It's a bitmap that shows the trash, but there's a lot of thinking behind it. And so an example of that in the conversational world is confirmation. So, for example, if I ask my bot, what is the price of the Tesla stocks today? As a designer, I can decide to say $700 or whatever that is today, I don't know, $700, or the Tesla stock price is $700. There's no technical difference between those two. There's a design difference. And when you say the Tesla stock price is $700, is you're implicitly telling the user that you understood what they said, right? It's a confirmation. And I expect this is a very strong convention that we're seeing right now, because we need the users to be sure that gain trust with your bot, right? And so that's a way to gain trust.
What are some other ways to gain trust? And if you think of trust in terms of like increasing over time as the person goes down the flow, like, is that a good way to think about it even? Is it like you have like maybe X amount of trust in the first message, and then slowly as you go further and further down, you're building trust more and more with the user. What are some of the things that you can do to do that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And trust is tricky because it takes time to build, and it takes more time to build and very short time to lose it, right?
Yeah.
Another thing, for example, that we see designers do, and I found myself do a lot when I'm designing this type of interfaces, is trying to create dedicated, we call them repair paths, or fallbacks. So instead of just saying, I'm sorry, I didn't understand you, doesn't matter where the user is in the interface, you can start designing and say, for example, I ask a specific question like, which product would you like to purchase? And if you say something I don't understand, instead of just saying, I'm sorry, I didn't get it, I can say something like, I'm sorry, I didn't get it. I was expecting a product like product X. That helps to build trust, because it's like, okay, like there's some sort of understanding here. And the parallel that I have in my mind is, if you go to a store, and you ask the clerk of the store, for example, is there jam? And I was in this situation the other day. Like I went there, we were both having a mask, so I'm not, you know, the communication is more difficult. I'm a foreigner and the guy's a foreigner, and we're both speaking a foreign language for both of us, which is not our native language. To ask where's jam, if the guy just says, I'm sorry, I don't understand, I would be pissed off. Like, that's not, you're not trying to help here, right? And so when you're designing this type of fallbacks, if you manage to create dedicated ones, then you can start to be helpful and build this trust.
Yeah, so it would be better, I don't know where the jam is, but we have peanut butter.
For example.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, because I really like this idea of very dedicated fallbacks. Yeah, and you can pick up the intent or the entity, whatever the goal of that conversation was, if it veered off. Is it a lot easier to do that now? So I'll give an example. And then you can also tell me a little bit more about context. Because for a long time, like context was awful. And now I think we're getting to a place where it's getting better. So for example, I go to a coffee shop and the barista says, what would you like to drink? And I say, give me a latte with 2 shots of espresso, right? Once upon a time, she would have asked me these things once at a time, right? But now you can do it all at once. I want a large coffee, 2 shots of espresso with 2% milk, right? Then she might ask me something like, do you want cinnamon on it, or do you want scones, or whatever the upsell is. And if I say, actually make it skim, right?
Okay.
I'm updating the milk portion of the order.
Right.
Right? Are the bots good enough now that it won't get confused? So when it's asking me if I want a scone, and instead of answering yes or no, I don't want a scone. Well, what would happen in that situation? Would the fallback be, I'm sorry, I didn't understand whether you wanted a scone or not. Or would it say, hey, I understand that you want to update your milk to skim, is that right? And then if I say, yeah, that's right, then it'll say, hey, did you still want the scone?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so premise, I think the Dialogflow team and the Rasa team have done an amazing job around these problems in the last 6 to 8 months. So I think the technological and also other solutions, have followed. So I think technologically you can do this stuff.
Right.
I think that the challenge right now for teams to actually bring this stuff to market is more about, okay, how much effort can we dedicate to each of those flows, because it multiplies, right? So like each question in each question for each intent.
It compounds.
It compounds, exactly. And so you want to make sure that if you're spending time on complexity, there is the right complexity to address. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is, and we feel this pain a lot for our users until they start to use Botsociety too, is it's difficult to visualize for a designer all of this different fallbacks and how they play into the final role. In order to, because that's at the same time difficult to visualize in theory and very plastic when you experience it from a brand experience point of view. So as I was saying before, like if the clerk didn't understand your point about skim, you would remember that about Starbucks. Like of all the way, it doesn't matter how many coffees you bought. If for 3 times they don't get you about that skim milk, you will remember that. So from a designer point of view, it's a very critical part. You want to get that right. But without the right tools, it's difficult to do it. So you may end up not doing that, which hurts the final user experience.
But at the same time, knowing which of these edge cases, for example, to develop, it's hard to know on the front end, because unless you have the data.
Right. I mean, yes. I think you can make an educated guess on like the most complex flow or the most important flow for you from a financial point of view or objective point of view. But yes, the other approach that you can take is release early to a subset of users. That's what we see a lot of our customers doing, and then grab some data and then do a version 2 of the design. That has a lot more details.
Got it. So what some of these companies are doing is they're basically having user groups play around with it just to see where those are, and then iterating upwards from there. One of the things that I find so interesting about bots that's like different than any other software really is like the failure rate, the way it fails. Because when you first start, you have to start somewhere, right? And I think the general wisdom right now is to find those use cases that are the most valuable. And for example, let's say customer service. And if you go into customer service, there are maybe hundreds or thousands of questions that your company gets asked. You want to focus on the ones that are getting asked 90% of the time or 95% of the time. right? So you like the low hanging fruit. And that's a great place to start because it instantly gives you value and ROI. On the flip side, those other questions are also going to get asked. So it's going to be successful really well, like, that 90% of the time, but that 10% where you have other questions, it might start to fail. So what are some ways where companies could think about failure in a way that's productive and without it being something that's scary, and at the same time not lose trust with the audience? Because you're not going to be able to maybe develop all the use cases, all the conversations you want initially.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very good way of thinking about it. Like, this is the use case that we want to tackle.
Yeah.
This is what we don't want to tackle. That's already a very good start. So I think, especially if you already have a custom flow of customer support requests, either on the phone or via text or chat, then starting to say, okay, we can automate this initial 10% because the complexity is low, and we will escalate the rest to a human. And being very clear with the stakeholders that that's the first step. And then when you design the interface, you can be clear with the user as well.
Yeah.
As long as there's clarity on that, we've seen a lot of success, because usually the users are getting smarter. So they know when they're talking with a customer support representative, a human, after 30 minutes for something that could be automated. Users know that. Like, they're feeling the frustration of saying, we could have done this automatically half an hour ago, right? So if you take that approach, we've seen a lot of success there in users saying, yeah, please let me talk to a bot because I need to do this immediately and it's not so complex. Versus, so for example, let's say, you have an insurance claim and it's just $200 because your TV broke. It's different than like you did a car accident where somebody got hurt, right? There's a difference of you wanting to automate it as a user, and also as a company. So usually there's a convergence there on what you want to do. So I think it's more about being able to define those use cases as critical and keeping the stakeholders aligned on one page of what is eventually a design file or a project or something like that.
Yeah. Do you think that, let me see, how common do you think customer service bots are right now? And I guess to back away a little bit, like, what are the top use cases as you see them right now? And like, how are they evolving? And then how prevalent are they?
Yeah, I think right now, for, I would say, a company that is present in all the states in the United States, for example, you would expect at least a part of the customer support to be automated, and at least a part of the, I would say, onboarding or new service, depending on what you're selling, to be automated as well. And so, especially if we're talking about services that require some sort of customization, right? So like, if you're buying, if you want to buy a Coke, okay, users don't expect that. But if you want to open a bank account, then it's a different matter. And so I think compared to 1 year ago, we're seeing at least double the incidence on user expectations. Then it's not always matched because companies moved at different speeds. So there's companies who have automated faster.
Yeah. What do you think are the biggest challenges right now in the space?
So for the ecosystem in general?
Yeah, so two parts. Like, one is overall, what do you think are the biggest challenges? And also in terms of like building bots. And then also, yeah, you can just talk about this piece of it. Biggest challenge. I think the one I really want to ask you is if you could, like, have a magic wand and solve a problem in the space, what would it be?
Oh,
So
that's yeah.
similar,
Uh,
different.
yeah, I think so. Right now, that's a very good question. I didn't think about that. Oh, okay. Okay. So the first one I think is, and that's something that we're really trying to solve with our new product, but we don't see it yet. The idea that those are all one type of interface that you can get expertise on. So if you're an expert in designing chat, there's a good chance you're very good at designing voice and developing for that as well.
Yeah.
And if you're a company, you're thinking about, for example, automating your IVR experience, those press one for this, press two for that, that's actually the same type of interface. And I don't know, like if you're thinking about an in-car experience, if you're thinking about a VR experience, you're gonna end up in the same bucket of experiences in the end, which require the same set of tools, the same set of expertise. I think that's kind of like still muddy at the moment in the industry, but it's getting clearer every day. But yeah, I think it's kind of like a similar situation that was like with web and mobile some years ago, where like, yeah, if you design a website on desktop, you can also design for mobile. You just need to know new concepts and new principles, but all the rest you can apply. That was kind of clear from the start for that type of ecosystem.
Yeah, and then what about for companies that are already making bots or using them either internally, like for HR backend bots, or externally for their customer service or their marketing? Like, and I think we need to like define by companies. Let's say they're like mid-sized to large companies,
right.
Mid to large cap. Like, what are their biggest challenges when it comes to bot projects in general? And I guess along the different steps of the product lifecycle, where are they experiencing, their biggest challenges?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think one of the fundamental differences between like a website and a chatbot, for example, project, is that on the chatbot you have the opportunity of automating even more, right? But at the same time, you need more iterations, both on the design and on the technology, on the training data. And so being able to structure, stakeholders' expectations and a team structure around that, it's one of the things that, you need to adapt in the organization to provide a good bot. And so we've seen organizations that were able to do this switch and automate large part of the businesses, and others that for reasons that are not their fault, it's just their history, they were not that agile. So I think that's one of the first things. And I would say the second thing is definitely the collaboration between the design part and the engineering part. So that we see that there's still a lot of gaps, and because think about that, right? If you will need someone from business, you will need someone from design to come up with this interactions, because the technological problem is complex enough that you will want people that do that just full time,
right?
So then how do you coordinate between those two? And we see a lot of companies that rely on stuff like spreadsheets, and that kind of like puts a gap on how complex an interface can be. And unfortunately, and that's kind of counterintuitive, if the interface is not complex, as in like it doesn't have enough messages, it doesn't have enough intents, it's not going to be easy to use for the user, because the bot will just say, I'm sorry, I don't get it. It won't be able to express itself. And so it will be harder to use. So yeah.
Do you recommend, and okay, so what would you recommend and what do you see more of? Do you see more like business leading bot projects or engineers leading bot projects? And then like for the companies that are putting these projects together, like what's the best way they could align it so that they're getting the right insights along the way. Because I think there's a substantial difference if you have like a lead that's an engineer versus a lead that's business versus a conversational designer, in terms of what type of insights they're going to gather from how people use the software.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure there's a one-size-fits-all answer. For sure, kind of like in any relationship, if there's just one side deciding everything, it's not healthy usually.
Right. Not deciding, but leading.
Yeah, but like exactly. So like if it's just a lead, then I would say for the majority of the companies whose business is not the conversational tech itself. So, and I would say the fair majority of the companies are like that. Like their focus is not building a bot. Their focus is like financial services or search engines or whatever. Like in that, no, search engine was the wrong example. But you get my point. So like if the focus is not the technology, then we usually see successful products led by the business needs. Then of course it has to be a conversation that it's ongoing between the two parts, and you need to make extra sure that you're leveraging what's possible technologically and what's possible also from a design point of view, what the users will expect, what the users are used to.
Okay. And then after they go live, obviously the biggest difference between like a bot and a website or an app is that those two are static content, whereas a bot is dynamic. So it's almost to a large degree co-created with your stakeholders, with all the users that are providing enormous amounts of feedback through their actions and informing you how to change your bot. Are companies struggling with that? Are they leaning into it? Is there, since there's such a huge difference between the way tech has been and now the way AI is changing that, is that a challenge for companies? Do they struggle maybe with having all this information and then maybe like not knowing what to do with it? Maybe they've had 100,000 messages. They know they're getting drop-offs after message 3, but then they're able to describe their problem, but they don't have prescriptions for them.
Right. Yeah. So we see companies doing a lot better than 1 year ago, I have to say. So
Okay.
I'm really excited about that. I think the ecosystem has grown a lot, and I think you can see that in like actual experiences are getting a lot better at the end.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that. But yeah, I mean, I think you need to plan for this characteristic of the chatbot where you have this, constant stream of data, which as anything, like can be an advantage if you manage it right, and it can be a disadvantage if you manage it wrong.
Right.
And so if you take that approach that it's like, okay, is the data is going to drive part of what we do, then, for example, I've seen a lot of companies releasing to a subset of user first and learning from that and then doing a bigger release. And also having thresholds that makes them decide, okay, for this, we just need more training data. So we're going to take, what the users are saying, we're going to feed the machine learning algorithm with that, but we're not going to change what the bot is going to say, right? And then there's another step, which is like, oh, we actually need a new use case. We actually need more detailed design here because people are getting stuck. We need to clarify. And so I think this distinction between how to use the data, is this just training data, which I don't want to discard, is very important, but it's just one of the things that you can do. I think this is one of the most difficult things to figure out, because it's where the collaboration between the more technical part and the business part has to go together way more than any other moment.
And just thinking about the next few years, how do you see bots evolving? Like, where do you expect them to be, and how do you expect for people to interact with them, and to what extent over the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, it's not the best moment to make any kind of prediction.
We
but
won't hold you to it.
I mean, if I have to bet, I would say that I think that compared to, I'm just gonna say like 2 years ago,
Uh-huh.
I see consumers way more likely to try to move forward with whatever they need to do with a company in case automatically than before. And so I expect companies to have long-term plans to automate entire business processes.
Yeah.
And so I totally see that in like 5 years, you're gonna be able to complete what now requires 2 or 3 different people from a company
Mm-hmm.
with either 1 or 2 different bots, not only in chat, but also on the phone, just by calling in, or also in real life, like in front of a screen on the streets, something like that. That's that's even more likely, unfortunately, with the things that we're seeing today, where social distancing is in place.
Yeah. The bot won't get you sick. So,
Exactly. No, but I mean it. Like
yeah.
it's gonna change our behavior in that as well, I believe.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is happening now more and more, and every time I go to a website, I hope and I expect this to be the case, but a lot of time it isn't. And that is for them to have a bot on there, like, these little bot widgets. And whenever I go now, I just ask it a question. And either it's going to be somewhat decent enough to give me an answer back, or a live person actually answers my question. And this experience saves me so much time from having to look through all their documentation, try to find something on their website. It just seems to me like this is going to become more and more common. In other words, the internet will become more conversational in this way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think to lean on that, I think also the stuff that we experimented, like you mentioned marketing bots, that's was the first use case. I expect those to come back when the technology is better on a different way. So for example, we're working a lot with Google. There's a section it's called Adilingo, and they're working on making conversational ads.
Okay.
When you see a banner, you click and start talking directly there.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Right? And it's kind of like you couldn't do that in 2017, and it's it's kind of like a use case going back now that kind of like returning strongly because of the new things that we're going to see. So that's also exciting. I think we're going to see this cycle going over and over again for quite some time.
I can just imagine how eye-catching it would be to be on a website and then to you're reading the article and then, hey, Vittorio, did you still want to buy the Mercedes? Or did you already buy one? Whatever.
That's not my brand, but yeah, would be good.
The BMW?
Nah.
Ferrari?
I think the last car I had was a Fiat from '97. It was amazing.
Okay.
Worked very well. Fiat Punto or something. Very. But yeah, absolutely, I see that, and like the thing is the technological capability and the design capability and the user expectations all need to grow at the same time.
Yeah.
You cannot have just one of those. So it's exciting to see this kind of like dialectic between users getting more advanced, technology getting better, and designers learning from both and coming up with new creative ways of leveraging this stuff.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find interesting is that, and we're seeing it more and more, like Bing played around with it, Google's played around with it, but like search result pages returning back and featuring bots. So because most searches that I do online, most searches you do online and all of us is like, you're either like trying to buy something, you're looking for a specific piece of information, right? What's the capital of France, this sort of thing. Or you're looking for entertainment, or you're trying to get something done. Like, you don't need to go to a different landing page in order to do those things. And I can see like Google or Bing being like the doorway to bots. And I think businesses really need to start considering like search engine optimization and how they're showing up on the first page of Google. And then also think about voice, because more and more searches are happening on voice. So what are you guys seeing in terms of voice?
Yeah, I think both use cases are interesting. Again, so our point of view there is that the difference between the voice experience and the chat experience is going to merge. So, for example, in the case of like search results, you may have a similar experience by, on your desktop, you search for something, and then the first result is a chat inside a website. On mobile, it can trigger like an RCS bot or an SMS bot. And then that interface may open an app that you can talk to as well. And so, but as you said, I think the capabilities that the companies will develop there, it's basically one knowledge of like, okay, how do we provide the best experience in this new interface? And how do we, because in the end, that's how the algorithm of Google and Bing works. Like if the users engage with the results, they will keep showing those results.
So last two questions. To what extent are you seeing companies using psychometrics in bots in terms of using and asking certain types of questions so they can get like an insight into the person's psychology and how they make decisions and how they're motivated? Are you seeing any of that yet, or is it so early that they're not really thinking about that?
So we've seen some early examples from some startups. We here in San Francisco, I talk often with the guys at Uber. They have an amazing bot app that is a bot that kind of like helps users around the world with anxiety. We interviewed them for our Conversation Design podcast, and basically you can take. I'm not an expert on this, so don't quote me on that. But like you can take the principles of psychology and like transfer them into an AI. But this is a startup that is doing this as full-time focus.
Yeah.
I think in the future, we're going to see that into a use case that is not focused on psychology, but it's going to take, I think, a little bit more to see that on scale and production. I can see experiments on that, but I would not just do it on the side.
Right. Yeah, it's its own field. It's a very deep, use case. One of the things that I've come across, and I think this is like an interesting way to think about it, is the AI gets more and more evolved, giving it goals, which is basically what most of the conversations are right now. They're very goal oriented. As it gets, I want to use the word smarter, and we'll use it just because we don't have another word that's as good. As the AI gets smarter, it will be able to help you automatically achieve those goals easier, but we don't know what the unintended consequences are. For example, you might say to Siri or Google, hey, why don't you, I want to eat pizza and just find me the cheapest pizza you can, right? And then Google says, okay, I'll find the cheapest pizza, and it orders pizza from like India, So I think the way that's going to, the way the problem of goals is going to get solved is by focusing on preferences instead. So instead of things being goal oriented, they can be preference oriented. And then within the context of like who I am and what my personality is like, people, the bot could automatically know that I live in San Francisco, that I like New York style pizza, that, I'm willing to spend $30 on a pizza pie. So, and then it takes those preferences all into consideration when helping me achieve a goal. So I think that's the one of the exciting things about psychometrics and bots. There's scary parts of it, but that's my 2 cents.
No, I totally agree, and I think it's always a balance between like building trust and being helpful without being too creepy on certain level. Right? But at the same time, like I want, like when I'm interacting with a company, I want them to know where I am. because it's very daunting not to be that. So.
So last question is, if you could wave a magic wand and solve one of these biggest problems for either users or companies or anything in the space, what would it be? How would you use it?
I would really like to have a shared understanding of conversational components, how to name them, and what's their role. And I think right now it's still a little bit balkanized. Like each messaging app has its own message types. Each each design tool.
Standard.
Yeah, there's still not like a shared language around this type of stuff. So hopefully that will change. It's changing already, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this. If the audience wants to follow up with you or find you, what's the best way they can do that?
I think the best way is sign up on Botsociety.io. And then there's a lot of ways of getting in touch with the team inside the app. And I'm always talking with all of our users there, either on the forum or inside the app.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for watching. And then if you have any questions, feel free to send a message to Vittorio and contact him at Botsociety. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.
This was great, Stefan. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.